and deputy leader in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where he leads the financial analysis of electric utility and regulatory business models. His current work quantifies the financial impacts of distributed energy resources on utility profitability and customer rates and bills. And he also presently leads and supports research on the value of demand response and energy efficiency to the utility system and utility investments in EV infrastructure. Scott Drake is the Director of Business and Technical Services at East Kentucky Power Cooperative and is responsible for developing, implementing, and managing the cooperative's power agreements with large customers and the cooperative's demand side services, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and demand response programs. And then Stephanie Leach is a principal business analyst within BGE's strategy team. Stephanie is helping to build a utility of the future by offering dynamic electric vehicle programs to Maryland's EV drivers. Since joining BGE in 2011, Stephanie's focused on providing solutions that allow customers to become their own energy managers. In addition to her role at the company, she currently serves as president of BGE's Eco Team. So we have a really fantastic lineup of short presentations today to help educate and then spark our conversation for later on in the meeting. Okay, so with that, I will pass it off to Andy for the first presentation. Andy, the floor is yours. Oh, just kidding. Sorry, wait. We have some event announcements first, and then I'll pass it to Andy.
Thanks. Great. Thanks so much, Commissioner. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some exciting research that we published recently here at Berkeley Lab, where we quantified the financial impacts of electric vehicles on utility ratepayers and shareholders. Before I launch into this, I did want to just acknowledge my excellent team of co-authors that helped with this, both JP Carvalho and Pete Kappers at Berkeley Lab, and then James Milford and Hadi Ashraghi, who work for Lumina Decision Systems and helped us with some of the analytical modeling work. And certainly want to also recognize our supporters in the U.S. Department of Energy's strategic analysis team in EERE for really supporting this work and encouraging us to push the boundaries on some of this financial analysis. So it's very exciting stuff. If we go to the next slide, please. So I think it's important to begin here with, why this matters. And so this is really about a balancing act, right, between the ratepayer impacts and the shareholder impacts when you think about the deployment of distributed energy resources, and in this case, electric vehicles. So why do we care about the ratepayer impacts? Well, this, really drives customer adoption of electric vehicles, as well as a balance among, what are the rate impacts for customers both with and without electric vehicles, and what does that mean around policy decisions? The other piece of this balancing act is around the utility shareholder impact. So this is particularly for utilities that are investor owned. How the utility collects revenues, and importantly, how it provides value to the investors, as well as, the scope of the utility shareholder impacts really kind of determines what is the utility's roles and responsibilities in deploying infrastructure to support electric vehicles. So I'm going to keep referring back to this balance between ratepayer and shareholder impacts and try and tie those in to the conclusions at the end. So you can go to the next slide. I have a number of slides here just to kind of set up the analysis. This is a financial analysis that we performed. We really wanted to there's lots of different assumptions one can make to ultimately end up with the shareholder and ratepayer impacts of electric vehicles. What we did was we wanted to begin by bounding this study largely based on the way in which electric vehicles are charged, right? Because that's going to really tell you how, what the sort of electricity system impacts are going to be. So what we did was, and there's a lot of different, assumptions one can make about, coming up with the hourly charging of electric vehicles. We settled on these two bookend assumptions. One characterized a charging strategy that really minimized the electric vehicle's impacts on the system annual peak demand. So we call that the low peak impact strategy. We bookended that with another strategy that was really maximizing or loading EV impacts on the utility's annual peak demand. We chose this because annual peak demand tends to drive, especially at the generation scale, tends to drive utility costs. And so because we really care about utility costs in this analysis, we really wanted to look at either minimizing or maximizing the EV charging impacts on peak. Obviously, there's lots of other objectives and other ways to sort of characterize these charging impacts, but that's what we used for this study. If we go to the next slide. So we used a financial analysis model that we've developed really over the last 14 or 15 years here at Berkeley Labs. This is a pro forma financial model. It's really intended to mimic the utility rate making process. So how are costs calculated as you change hourly consumption, and how does that drive changes in utility production costs in some of at both the generation, transmission, and distribution levels. What are some of the ways in which those costs are then allocated to different customer classes, and how do you collect revenues? I mean, this should sound very familiar. It's sort of the rate setting process, and we can make assumptions about rate design. We can make assumptions about utility financial incentives in this model, and we can have these rate cases every couple of years or not. So really intended to speak to the world that you all live in on a regular basis. And what comes out of the model are metrics, financial metrics like achieved return on equity and earnings for shareholder impacts, and average retail rates and bills for ratepayer metrics. We've used this again last 14, 15 years, several states. We've used it for technical assistance work, lots of foundational research. It's just gone through a lot of stakeholder and external validation through those processes. Go to the next slide. So we characterized a summer peaking vertically integrated utility intended to represent sort of average costs across utilities in the US. So this isn't a specific utility. We kind of merged together characteristics. And what we ended up with was this set of sort of costs in our analysis period from 2021 to 2040. And so we modeled these costs in that Finder model I talked about. The most probably, I guess, salient data point here is just to look at the average all-in retail rate, which is that orange or yellow line, and it's roughly about 12 cents per kilowatt hour in 2021, and it just about roughly doubles to 2040, and that's pretty consistent with both rate levels today on average again, and then what sort of expected growth is over the next 20 years. So go to the next slide. So we want to, represent electric vehicles on utility costs, and key piece of that is how do we represent them in aggregate on utility sales. And so we came up with some different EV penetration scenario assumptions to represent different deployments of EVs. We had a low EV penetration scenario, which resulted in about a 1.5% increase in retail sales by 2040. The high EV penetration case, which really ramped that up to about a 9% increase in 2040. And then we also characterize what we called sort of a high vehicle miles traveled, which really pushed the envelope further. So these are really aggressive deployments. Most states are probably not going to see anything close to the high EV penetration, and many of them will barely get to that low EV penetration. But we did want to push the boundaries a little bit and see what the impacts there were. Go to the next slide, please. So there's two kind of cost groupings that to keep in mind before we get into the results here. First, we wanted to characterize how electric vehicles impact utility generation and supply costs. Really, the point here is that we, inside our model, used a least cost planning assumption. And so we mimicked the utility's IRP process to make sure that it built generation to serve this EV load that was least cost and sort of cost optimized, and took into account all the things that utilities tend to in IRPs, including renewable production value, forecasts on an hourly basis, and tried to minimize those costs. So we go to the next slide. The other group of costs that we wanted to capture were how EVs impact the distribution costs. And so we actually use a set of expert and publicly available assumptions about the probability of upgrading feeders given our penetrations of electric vehicles I just showed you. We also captured any costs related to the utility investing in EV charging infrastructure. So we pulled from a bunch of regulatory filings data around what those costs were, as well as drew on a regulatory case in Maryland about capping certain program size and levels of investment for the utility in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then we also built in some cost assumptions around program costs, right? If the utility is encouraging electric vehicle adoption, they might be also implementing some programs around that. So we, again, pulled from some regulatory filings to inform those assumptions. So go to the next slide. So with that set up, I'll get into the results now. So we wanted to first look at the financial impacts of electric vehicles under this high peak impact charging strategy. So again, this is the one bookend that really loads those EV impacts on system peak. So you would expect these to be sort of the highest cost impacts. And we're comparing this to a utility without any incremental EVs. So go to the next slide. So what this results in are generally an increase in shareholder earnings and retail rates remaining roughly unchanged over our analysis period. So these are average retail rate impacts in the dark blue and earnings impacts in the lighter blue on a 20-year net present value basis. And you can see here again that the rates are roughly unchanged. Earnings go up pretty dramatically. This is a result of those costs, right? So the utility to meet this new EV load is building new generation and investing in the distribution network and some amount of the EV charging. And so as they add those costs and capitalize those costs, that increases the amount that they're able to earn. And that retail rates are roughly unchanged, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the EV penetration, just because you're spreading those costs over an increasing sales base. But we'll get to the next slide. This is what I thought was the most interesting finding. I've been doing this research for 14 years now, and I thought this was really neat, that the timing of these rate impacts really matters and is something to keep in mind. So what we did here was we broke those rate impacts I just talked about into different time periods, so 5-year chunks going forward into our analysis. And what you see is that those rate impacts really change in these 5-year increments depending on when you're making the So it's just really important to kind of track these things over time. I'll talk about the implications of them, but I thought this was interesting. We'll go to the next slide, please. Yep.
Unfortunately, your audio cut out when you were most excited about what's on the last slide. So would you mind repeating your key points from this slide before?
Yeah, sure thing. No, that's yeah, we should definitely hit the most exciting findings. So here was what I found to be the most exciting is that as you break up these rate impacts into 5-year chunks in our analysis period, you see that the timing really matters. And what these timing changes are driven by in the rate impacts is when you make these large lumpy generation and distribution capital investments. So depending on the time period you're looking at, you could make different assumptions about whether or not electric vehicles result in rate increases or rate decreases. And that's really highlighted in this high EV penetration, that these large lumpy upfront investments to accommodate future EVs really drive rates up in the early period of the analysis time. But in the later periods, there's a really significant decrease in average retail rates as those electric vehicles show up and those sales reduce the costs. So I'll talk a little bit more about the implications of this in the conclusions here in a moment. Thanks, Robert. So what we're going to do is now look at, well, what if we implement this low peak charging impact, or low peak impact charging strategy, and we shift those EV impacts off peak? So we're going to compare this to what we just talked about. Let's go to the next slide. So under a low peak impact charging strategy, we see, go to the next slide, that rates and earnings decline. So this low peak impact charging strategy is really effective at reducing those utility costs, and that further drives retail rates down and drives earnings down. Now, we may see this as a little bit of an imbalance, right? Because now utility shareholders are worse off and ratepayers are better off. But it's important to understand that these earnings impacts I'm showing you are compared to the high peak impact charging strategy. So utility shareholders are still seeing an earnings increase. It's just not as much under these low peak impact or sort of managed charging strategies. Go to the next slide. Here's just the values. You can see that really this low peak impact charging strategy reduces capital costs by a lot, anywhere from 86% to 29% given our assumptions. And it's quite dramatic a reduction, especially on the generation side. Go to the next slide, please. We also tested this over a number of sensitivities. I think the point here is just to say that the results we found were really consistent in terms of a reduction in retail rates and a reduction in earnings as you shift the EV impacts off peak to an off peak period. So we found them to be directionally consistent. We'll go to the next slide. We also wanted to look at this on a sort of a dollar per EV basis, and the story still remains the same, that if you implement managed charging strategies, you can really reduce the incremental annual cost of integrating these EVs by anywhere from 38 to 62%. And that's a pretty dramatic reduction, and could be the beginnings of conversations around the right incentives, to pay vehicles to charge off peak. And we'll go to the last slide, which should be the key findings here, just final takeaways. We found that ratepayers are almost always better off, and even more so if you deploy electric vehicles under these managed charging strategies and shift to the charging load to off-peak times. Compared to a future without electric vehicles, we found that shareholders are also better off, but these managed charging strategies can erode some of those incremental earnings. But we still, in that balance, may see a win-win, in that we see a reduction in retail rates and some increase in shareholder earnings. A forward-looking and longer-term perspective really is necessary when we talk about electric vehicle rate impacts, because you're making these large initial utility infrastructure investments to enable greater deployment that will result in those later rate decreases. So having a longer-term perspective and thinking beyond rate impacts over the next 2 to 3 years and thinking them over the next 20 years is pretty critical. These impacts are pretty small on a total utility basis. We didn't look at particular customer classes and different cost recovery mechanisms, which may shift the magnitude of some of these. And the other piece of this is that, to get the type of managed charging that we modeled here, you're really going to have pretty dynamic infrastructure planning processes and pretty flexible managed charging strategies to think about every year where I need to shift that EV load, both in terms of location as well as time. So with that, I think that's the last slide I had, and I'll pass it back over to, I don't know if there's going to be a transition to the next speaker, or if you guys want to do questions and answers now.
We're going to do just a very brief clarifying question only right now. If anybody has any clarifying questions, this was a ton of information, and I know I have a lot I want to talk about, but we'll wait for the substantial questions until after all three presenters. But if anyone has any clarifying questions, you can either type them into the chat or come off mute right now and just ask them directly. I'll pause for a second to see if there are any. Okay, fantastic. If anything comes up, feel free to type it into the chat, and we can revisit at the end of the following presentations. But next, we will go to. Oh, so thank you, Andy, and please stick around, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions at the end here. But next, we'll move to Scott Drake from East Kentucky Power Cooperative. Scott.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to speak about a program that we're developing. And I'm going to pile on a little bit about what Andy talked about, but specifically about EV home charging the EVs while at home, and how can we as a utility create, a cost-effective program for that. Next slide. So EKPC, we're a traditional G&T cooperative. You can see our peak and our amount of generation, which is almost the same. We also have a transmission system. We are a transmission owner. So we're a traditional G&T cooperative. We're owned by 16 distribution cooperatives. You can see the area in the state there that we serve. It's about 550,000 meters, mostly in rural Kentucky. We're fully integrated in the PJM market since 2013. And uniquely, we're regulated. Most distribution co-ops and G&Ts across the nation are not regulated by the state utility commission, but we are. Both the G&T, East Kentucky Power, and all 16 of our owner member cooperatives that own us, we're all regulated by the Kentucky Public Service Commission. And together, the 17 of us, we brand ourselves as Kentucky's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives. Next slide. So when we started thinking about EVs and the impact of EVs on our utility business, we started thinking about what we know, what we don't know. And some of the things we think we know is this is an increase in energy sales. So that's good. That allows us to spread those costs over more kilowatt hours, a new load in the residential homes that we haven't had that in a long time. But that diversified demand is another game. And you know, at peak, it's not bad right now. It's probably less than 1 kW at 5 o'clock. That's when we peak in PJM. But we're concerned that that demand is growing. And we really don't peak around 10 p.m. as far as the pure EV demand load. We think it's probably later in the evening, well past 5 p.m., but yet 5 p.m. still impacts our cost. Chargers are getting larger, you know, the Ford F-150 Lightning, you're talking about a 19.2 kW demand. That's really pushing that demand if they come on during peak at 5 o'clock. If they're plugging in an F-150 Lightning, that's really hitting that demand. And that erodes all of the benefits of those more energy sales. So as Andy was talking about, us being a not-for-profit, consumer-owned utility, we really like to have a program to shift that charging of the EVs to the off-peak hours, so that we can you know, make the best situation for us at the utility with the energy sales without a lot of demand, or at least in the G&T world, a capacity cost. So, you know, we really want to drive high levels of participation in a program to for our EV owners to participate in, to shift. And we don't think we're doing well in that program unless we're able to do that. Next slide. Here you see a graph of the hourly demand, and we stole this from a Duke report that came out many years ago, so it's a bit dated. But nonetheless, it kind of shows on an hourly diversified hourly shape of the demand of EVs. And you see that peaking there at 10 o'clock, and of course our peak in PJM is about 5. So that's our cost center. But what's unique about this is not only is it old, and we've got a lot larger chargers, level 2 chargers going into the homes now versus in 2014. Look at that note there on the right. This data comes from urban and suburban areas. In 2014, pretty much all the EVs were in urban and suburban areas. There wasn't much in rural America, and not in rural Kentucky. So does that load shape, is that the diversified load shape of EVs in rural Kentucky? We have no idea. We don't have any data. And of that, about 550,000 homes that we are homes and businesses that we serve, we think we may have 500 EVs total. Kentucky is just late to the game on new technology. We're not early adopters in general. So we just don't have the data for this. Next slide. So as we were thinking about how do we build a successful program that gets a lot of participation to shift from on-peak to off-peak consumption hours, we started thinking about what a strategy has to do. Obviously, the first thing is shift to off-peak consumption hours, but it needs to be low cost for the utility to implement. It needs to be low cost for the participant. We want a high participation rate, but if it costs a lot for the EV owner to participate, they're not going to participate in our program. It's got to be easy for them to participate. If we're going to force them to put in level 2 chargers that we can talk to and have a second meter on the house, those types of things, that's not low cost, and that's not easy for the participant. They have to hire electricians and things of that nature. It needs to save them a lot of money each month, or they're not going to be interested in participating in our program. Minimizing lifestyle change, time of use. I know a lot of utilities use time of use. In Kentucky, pretty much all of our distribution co-ops have a time of use rate, and nobody's on. There's virtually no one on a time of use rate, less than 0.1%, because it changes lifestyle too much. Rural Kentucky is not interested in. Every one of our distribution co-ops has a traditional flat per kilowatt hour residential rate without a demand charge or a time of use. Time of use is an option, but again, nobody's on it. So how do we get to like an 80% participation? I think those programs have to be these types of have these characteristics. So I challenged a group before, and the reason I was asked to talk about this, it was co-ops at a large co-op meeting. So are we designing our managed programs to achieve these goals? And I don't think we probably are in co-op land. So we kind of started taking a different approach to this. Next slide. Traditionally, there's a couple ways that utilities, co-ops in particular, in rural America are trying to manage the charging at home, trying to get that shift from peak to off peak. One is where the utility manages that load, kind of like a direct load control program or a thermostat program. It requires a utility compatible level 2 charger. Well, that's really interesting because Tesla right now is the dominant player in EV market. And we cannot talk to Tesla chargers and use the utility communication into those chargers to manage the amount of kilowatt hours going into the Teslas at 5 p.m. That's not an option. So we're going to have to try to talk the Tesla owners out of their Tesla level 2 charger and put our charger in. And I don't know if you've met any Tesla owners, but they're fiercely loyal to Tesla and much more loyal to Tesla than our other electric company. We just don't think that's going to happen. And a lot of other EV owners, not Tesla owners, but other ones, they've already invested in probably a level 2 charger. Now we're coming along and say, use our level 2 charger. They're probably not real interested in doing that. And you're also going to get pushback because they've invested a lot of money in their EV, maybe 50,000 or higher in their EV, and then they're going to turn around and give the utility control of when they can charge their vehicle. We just don't think that's a winning solution for the vast majority. Now, the early adopters, it's probably fine because they want to promote EVs. They love this concept of EVs. But as we're moving past early adopters in the EV world, and we just don't think that's a long-term solution. So that's one way. Utility managed charge is one traditional way we see in co-op land that co-ops are trying to build these programs. Next slide. And the other way is the time use rate. There's a couple obviously different ways you can do time use rate. You can change the whole home to the time use rate. This is wildly unpopular in Kentucky. It changes lifestyle way too much, and there's penalty for using power at 5 or 6 o'clock. And at least it's seen as a penalty in our customer, our members' minds, and it's just wildly unpopular in Kentucky. So we're like, unless we force the EV owner to go on a program like a time use rate, then I don't think our membership is going to select a time use rate at a very high level, not at 80% participation. The one thing that our membership in rural Kentucky doesn't like change. The other thing they hate worse than change is being forced to do something they don't want to do. So we just don't think that's a winning solution. We could build a time use rate for the EV only. In doing so, what you get is basically a penalty for charging during on peaks. At least that's the perspective of our EV owners. And that's kind of what it is. It reflects a little bit more of the utility costs. So there's a higher cost at 5 o'clock versus 2 a.m. But we just don't see that our membership liking the concept that they pay so much more at 5 o'clock if they have to charge at home. So, but also, where does that data come from if we want to create a time use rate? Remember that curve? That's not in rural Kentucky. I don't have the data to show what the demand is every hour of the day, a diversified demand from the EVs. So we're kind of guessing at the information to build a time use rate in rural Kentucky. And how much money does that EV owner have to save each month, send less to us each month to offset their risk of a penalty if they were needing to charge 2 or 3, 4 days a month at 5 o'clock and being hit with a very high time use rate at that time? Does this require a second meter? Some co-ops are requiring a second meter. Again, we think that costs too much. That's going to drive down participation. Because when you put a second meter in, you probably have to even if you're doing sub-meter, you may have to get an electrician involved. And usually there's a monthly fee associated with another meter. Utilities charge a fee for that meter. All of that costs too much. That's going to drive down participation rates. So how do we get, next slide, how do we get higher participation? So we started thinking about kind of a DR-like program to achieve these goals. Pay a DR incentive, a demand response incentive, kind of like thermostats or direct load control. It can either be a flat per month incentive, which is how we run our thermostat program, or it could be a certain amount per kilowatt hour. What's interesting about with today's technologies and telematics, we can get the per kilowatt hour going into the car, into a specific EV at a specific address, geofenced to that address, every hour of the day. That information is available. It comes out of the OEMs. We don't have to install another meter or anything like that. There's no installations at the home. It really minimizes the cost for the utility to be able to do this. So we can get very granular information about the kilowatt hours going into the car every hour of the day. And if we were to do something like that, there's no additional cost to the home or the EV owner to participate in this program. There's no special installations, no monthly fees or anything of that nature that would be associated with this, as long as we, the utility, are paying for the telematics. And in a DR program, we can afford to do that. What's interesting about what we decided to kind of think about is don't change the EV owners' electric rate. So there's no lifestyle change for them. If they need to charge at 5 o'clock, well, they don't get the incentive. But if they wait until the all-peak hours, then they get the incentive. They get a discount on their rate. Give them control of participating in events or not. So again, we're thinking if 5 o'clock's peak, and if they're not needing to charge, then they can wait to 10 o'clock, which is our off-peak, but from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. If they do that, then they get the incentive. Make the process easy, easy sign up. Telematics, these companies facilitate online sign up. So, if we were to use this type of a situation to basically quantify the amount of incentive, so it's not a time of use where it has to be revenue quality metering. We're just trying to quantify the incentive to provide to that EV owner each month. We make this really easy. So we can get that data and give the incentive on the bill and not have to, the participant don't have to install anything at the home. They really just sign up on their phone. Next slide, please. So what that led us to is us 17 Kentucky's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives developing a pilot. And again, we're regulated by the Kentucky Public Service Commission. And we filed a tariff, it's a rider, a DR rider to the normal electric rates. And that's pending approval right now at the commission. And so it's for all of our owner member cooperatives to offer their residential EV owners. We are looking at a 2 cent per kilowatt hour incentive for charging during those off-peak hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And 2 cents to us represents about a 20% discount. Our typical all-in residential rate is about 10 cents in rural Kentucky. So we proposed to our commission to do this on a 3-year pilot. It's cost-effective demand response program with a TRC of 2.47. And it's an all carrot program. There's no stick in this. So if somebody needs to charge at 5 p.m. because they need to run an errand, then there's no penalty for that. They just pay the base rate. They just don't get the incentive. So we're kind of expecting high participation rates, and this should be easy for the participant too, the EV owner, because they sign up one time online, and then they program the car one time, and they put that. Each EV has the capability of putting in the utility rate, so that it knows when to start charging and stop charging. So they program the car one time to start at 10 p.m. and stop at 6 a.m. Then every time they plug in at home, they don't have to do anything unless they need to go ahead and charge it, and they can override their programming, but one time is all they have to do that. So we also want to make this easy for our co-ops because we have 16 co-ops. So we said, all right, we can handle EKPC at the GNT. We'll handle all the signups. We'll build a website, skin it to our own member cooperatives. So it says Kentucky's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, but also the co-op name like Bluegrass Energy or Clark Energy. So it looks like it's our owner members website, and we'll obtain all the telematics for all the participants. We'll pay the incentives to the retail bill each month. What's unique about this is you don't really have to do a cost of service study and special time use rate justifications that we don't really have the data for anyway. There's no installations and no data entry for our co-ops. So our owner member cooperatives, the 16 one, yeah, let's try this. Hopefully we can get high participation rates. Probably the most important thing from us, a utility standpoint, long-term out of this pilot, is to obtain the statistically significant energy and demand data in rural Kentucky for EVs. Also, EV locations in Kentucky, we don't know where the EVs are. Like I said, we think we have 500. We have no idea where they're at. The counties will only, DOTs will only give us county location. So we don't, and we're so intertwined with the investor owns in virtually every county. We're not certain where the EVs are located, if they're located on our lines or the investor owned lines. And also we want to evaluate that 20% discount. Is that enough to incentivize the membership that have EVs to participate in the program? So that was our thought process. It's a little bit different than probably most utilities, but we're hoping this is a winning solution for EVs in rural Kentucky. Next slide.
Thanks, Scott. That was fascinating. Really excited to get into the discussion on this. But first, we'll pause for any clarifying questions from any of our members, and then we'll get into the discussion after our final presentation. So I will. You can either again type those clarifying questions into the chat, or just come off mute and ask them right now, and I'll pause for a minute. Okay, fantastic. All right, well, thanks, Scott. Please do stick around for the next presentation so we can chat with you after this. But for the next presentation, we have Stephanie Leach. Stephanie, I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you. I appreciate going after Andy and Scott. I feel like I can lift some of the elements from their presentation, and luckily I included some of their topics in mind. So hopefully I can kind of round out the three presentations with some of the information from what I'm going to share here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Leach. I'm a principal business analyst at BGE, Baltimore Gas and Electric Company. And I'm going to share a little bit on some of the work that we've been doing on electric vehicle programs here in Maryland. You can move on to the next slide. So Maryland has some ambitious net zero emission goals. We have set a goal to reach 300,000 zero emission vehicles on the road by 2025. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to reach that goal quite by 2025. We're actually on track to hit that closer to 2028. But we're doing some work to try to move toward that goal line a little bit faster. So just last year, Maryland passed the Climate Solutions Now Act, which is probably the most aggressive net zero emissions goal in the nation. So although a lot of other states have set formal GHG reduction goals, none have required a 60% reduction by a date as ambitious as 2031. So we are doing our part here at BGE, which is Maryland's largest utility, to support the state's goals, and we're reducing our own emissions as well. So one of the things that came out of that includes the Electric School Bus Act, the push to reach net zero emissions for the entire state by 2045, And then there are also a lot of great ways that we can use the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to kind of look for additional ways that we can support that goal. Additionally, earlier this year, Governor Westmore passed the Advanced Clean Cars Rule 2, which mandates that all light-duty passenger vehicles sold in the state of Maryland must be an electric vehicle by the year 2035. So we're doing our part to educate consumers on what that's going to mean for them as they're going to purchase a new vehicle now, and how things are going to change over the next decade as they're slowly going to be transitioning to all electric vehicles by the year 2035. And as we are getting more electric vehicles on the grid, that's going to mean a lot of work for us as a utility to keep up with that additional load, electric load growth. So we're designing a lot of EV programs to help kind of mitigate any sort of stress we're going to see. So next slide, please. In support of these historic goals that the state has set, we launched what we call our EV Smart program in 2019. So the first iteration of the EV Smart program was a 5-year pilot approved by the Maryland Public Service Commission in January 2019. The program launched in July of 2019, and it will run through the end of this year. We're actually working on the development of our next cycle, just filed with our Public Service Commission last week for the 2024 through 2027 program years. So you can see some of the elements of the programs that we currently have in our portfolio. Some of the items that I'll call out just for brevity here are the residential charger rebate, which was extremely popular for our residential customers who are looking to upgrade their charging infrastructure. So we gave an incentive for customers to purchase a smart level 2 charger for their home. That does a couple of things. By having customers apply for a rebate, it helps us know where these EV drivers are within our service territory. So they purchase a new charger, they apply for a rebate from BGE, and then we can better track these customers. We ask that they give us their charging data. So on a monthly basis, we can see all of this charging data on a weekly basis, on an hourly basis. And it just helps us understand how this load growth is going to continue over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Once that rebate closed, we moved on to a $50 annual home charging incentive. So this incentive is given at the end of a calendar year if a customer maintains 90% or more off-peak charging. And the way that we can validate whether or not that they are maintaining that 90% off-peak charging is through the charger. So if they have an eligible smart charger, or through the telematics within the vehicle. So they have to have a specific OEM that is eligible for our program, or a specific charger that's eligible for our program. And the last one I'll cover is the vehicle charging time of use rate. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So our vehicle charging time of use rate launched May 1st, 2020. We were looking for a way to kind of meet a customer need that was very present here in the state of Maryland. We have a good concentration of electric vehicles. And when we launched our EV programs back in 2019, we had a lot of our EV drivers who were saying, where is an EV rate? How can we participate in off-peak charging? Where are the discounts for us when we're charging at home? And so it was really important to us as a utility to try to find a way to implement this EV only rate for customers. And so this was really a first of its kind of rate in the way that we set it up. So we offer a special time of use rate for electric vehicle charging. This customer price plan provides a benefit of a reduced electric bill to customers who charge their vehicle during off-peak hours. In order to enroll, a customer has to have either an eligible charger or an eligible electric vehicle. The residential customer must own either a smart charger, which the eligible options are listed here, a charge point or juice box. and that data is fed through our third-party vendor Energy Hub, or they have to have an eligible vehicle that we can get that data through vehicle telematics. So Tesla, Hyundai, Kia, Toyota, Lexus, and we have a whole pipeline of additional OEMs that our vendor WeaveGrid is onboarding over the course of 2024 and 2025. So we'll be rolling out additional manufacturers here in the coming months and coming years. So quite similar to the way that Scott was kind of talking about it, we get 15-minute pings from the vehicle, and it tells us anytime a customer has plugged in their vehicle, what energy that vehicle has consumed, and that is then transmitted from WeaveGrid's platform back directly into our billing system. So we can get that real-time data. I can go into our billing system. If a customer says, "Hey, I want to know, are you getting my charging information?" I can actually in real time go in and look and see how much a customer has spent on charging up until the day before. So it's really helpful for us to be able to communicate to a customer how much they're spending on EV charging for their home, at home, and that they can see that information real time on their bill. So BGE is using the embedded metrology from the residential chargers as revenue grade data to bill TOU rates. Customers' EV charging consumption is displayed on their bill as a credit. So this is actually a rate rider. Unfortunately, when we went to go implement this in 2020, our billing system was going through a freeze. And so we weren't able to put this in as a full rate, but we're looking to do that in 2024. So right now it's just a rate rider. So the charging appears as a credit to the customer when they charge off peak. So if an average customer who might drive 15,000 miles per year could save approximately $120 per year by participating in this rate and charging during off-peak hours. So on the right here, we actually have our vehicle charging time of use rate page on our website where customers can go. They can compare their current electric rate to the time of use rate. They can put in how many miles they travel per year, and then slide their charging time on a little ticker, and it'll tell them how much they would spend on average on charging if they were to switch to this electric rate and charge at home. So it really gives customers a realistic view of what it's like to own an EV, and how that's going to affect their electric bill if they stay on their regular rate or if they switch to our vehicle charging time of use rate. Next slide. So Scott also mentioned a whole home rate. We've had a whole home time of use rate since probably 2016. And so I just wanted to kind of share how the two stack up against each other. Our vehicle charging time of use rate, which launched in May 2020, has just over 2,000 customers enrolled in it, whereas our EV whole house rate, which launched in 2016, only has about 250 customers on it. The difference being that the EV whole house rate is exactly as it sounds. It's a whole house rate. You have to put your entire home on this time of use rate. So if that doesn't work out for your lifestyle and you can't put everything you do in your home on, push those things on to off-peak times, like if you can't do your dishwasher or your clothes washing and drying at 9 p.m., then that whole house rate doesn't really benefit you. Whereas the vehicle charging time of use rate is just specifically for the vehicle. So you can keep your entire home on a regular standard electric rate, and just the vehicle itself would be on that vehicle charging time of use rate. So our customers are finding it extremely beneficial to be on this rate. Both of these rates, the on-peak, off-peak price is the same. So for customers, the on-peak rate is 19 cents, and then the off-peak rate is 6 cents. So it's a huge swing. The off-peak is about a third of the cost of the on-peak. And so it's really trying to encourage customers to shift their charging towards times that are more conducive for the grid. So this is just a display of what it's like in the summer and the winter months. And we send customers communication when that's going to change. So tomorrow, an email will go out to all of our vehicle charging time of use rate participants to say, remember, you need to shift the hours when you charge your vehicle at home, so you aren't going to be penalized by a higher electric bill for the summer months. As I mentioned, the vehicle charging time of use rate is actually a rate rider. So it appears as a credit on the bill versus the vehicle charging, the EV whole house rate, which is the rate for the whole home. So it would appear as just the electric rate on a customer's bill. We're looking to phase out the EV whole house rate, just knowing that it's not conducive for a lot of customers. We do have other time of use rates here at BGE. Customers find this one to be a little confusing. They don't really understand the difference between the vehicle charging TOU rate and the whole house rate. So in our filing that we just sent to the Maryland Public Service Commission, where we've proposed making vehicle charging TOU rate an actual rate in 2024 and to phase out the whole house rate. So that's something that we're hoping will provide a lot of clarity for customers moving forward. Next slide, please. So for those customers who participate in the TOU rate or through our $50 annual home charging incentive through their vehicle, they actually get weekly energy summaries through WeaveGrid, who's our third-party provider. So they can see on a weekly basis how they're doing with their charging, how they're doing with their costs, their spending, when their charging is occurring, and whether or not they need to make any sort of changes to ensure that they're charging during off-peak hours. So it's just helping reinstitute and reaffirm those behavioral changes that we need customers to make, or to reinforce positive rewards for those customers who are doing really well with their off-peak charging behavior. Next slide. And then the second piece that I wanted to discuss is our managed charging program. So I see Lee Slezak from the Department of Energy is on the line. So Lee, I know you're very familiar with this project, but in 2020, we launched our managed charging pilot. So we call it our Smart Charge Management Pilot. This is a joint initiative between BGE and our sister utility PHI in Maryland. I think a lot of people on the call are obviously very familiar with managed charging, so I don't need to go into that. I'll just say that as more and more EVs are on the grid, we can't just rely on time of use rates to make sure that we have a stable, reliable electric grid. Because if we are going to put all of our customers on a time of use rate and ask them to shift their charging to 9 p.m., that's going to result in another peak time. Just as with air conditioning, as we see on hot summer days, everyone cranks up their air conditioning, and then at 2 p.m. we run into potential issues, which is why we have demand response events. So managed charging is a form of essentially a demand response program that we're implementing for electric vehicles. Next slide, please. For our residential program, which I'm going to focus on, we are looking to enroll 5,000 residential customers into this managed charging pilot by June 2024. This is just a pilot program. It only runs through the end of 2024, and we're looking to test how active managed charging can help push customers' charging experience to more conducive times for the grids. So we started our recruitment for these customers in November of 2022, and we, within 6 months, already have a little over 2,000 customers enrolled in the program. What we're seeing right now with our existing time of use rates is that a lot of our low-hanging fruit customers are ineligible. So if a customer has solar panels on their home, or if they're on our budget billing program, they're not eligible for our time of use rate. And a lot of our EV drivers also have solar. It's kind of like those two go hand in hand together. So they're finding that they're a little bit frustrated with their options and ways to save. So managed charging is a great option for those customers if they're looking for another way to save and to provide benefits to the grid as well. Next slide. So how does our managed charging program work? This is also run by our partner WeaveGrid. So WeaveGrid and the utility will throttle when the customer's charging takes place using the vehicle's telematics. So as more and more electric vehicles are concentrated in specific neighborhoods, we're going to see greater stress put on those feeders and those substations. And in order for us to alleviate some of that stress associated with EV charging, we'll be optimizing when participants charging is taking place. So while time of use rates are a very passive way of managing a customer's charging and only requires that a customer charge during specific hours of time, our smart charge management program is an active managed charging program that takes many situational factors into account when scheduling a vehicle's charging. So some of the things that we think about when managing a customer's charge is what electric rate are they on? Are they on a time of use rate? If so, we make sure that they are charging during off-peak times. So that's factor number one, and probably the highest priority for a customer in managed charging. The next factor that we consider when layering in additional features for managed charging is PJM price signaling, so our regional grid operator. So what's the cost of energy throughout the day? How does that fluctuate? And when is the cheapest time to charge on the grid? So we also look for the cheapest windows of time throughout the day, and that's especially going to be important this summer during the swing time. So summer and winter, we look for the cheapest times to charge a customer's vehicle. So if they're not on a time of use rate and they're just on a standard rate, when's the cheapest time for us to charge their vehicle? Additionally, we look at weather patterns. If there's a demand response event that's potentially coming, how can we use electric vehicles as an asset? So how can we shift that charging to a time that's not going to impact peak grid strain? And then lastly, as more and more EVs are going to be concentrated in specific neighborhoods, I can tell you in my neighborhood, it's like every other house now has an electric vehicle. How do we ensure that we don't put additional stress on feeders that are already feeling overwhelmed by high electric load? So what we're going to be doing is looking at nested optimization. And if there are a lot of EVs that are all trying to charge at the same time, what our managed charging program does is look at a particular neighborhood or a particular feeder and say, customer A will charge from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Customer B will charge from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. and so on. So that way, not every customer is charging at the same time, and we can ensure reliability within a particular zip code or a particular feeder. Next slide. So the benefits to the customer for participating in this program is they get $10 a month for participation, which equates to about 10% of the average customer bill here in Maryland, and is roughly comparable to other managed charging programs across the country. Customers do have the option to opt out of that managed charging schedule during a particular day. So what they do is they tell us, they plug in their vehicle when they get home, and they tell us when they need their vehicle ready the next day. So they can plug in at 5 p.m. when they get home from work and say they need it ready by 6 a.m. And then any time from that 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. window, we can manage their charge. But there are times when a customer might plug in and decide, I actually need to run out to the grocery store. I need my vehicle to start charging now. They go into their app and say, charge now. That's considered an opt-out. So a customer can opt out 4 times before they are penalized. Once they hit their 5th opt-out, they lose their monthly bill credit. So if they don't opt out, they continue to receive the $10 per month. There will be no penalty. They won't be kicked out of the program. It's just any month that they hit that 5th opt-out, they won't get that $10. Next slide. And just wrapping up here, just wanted to show you some of the successes that we've had so far in this program. So we launched our smart charge management program on December 7th. That's when we actually started actively managing customers' charging. You can see that for those customers who have applied for our home charging incentive, meaning they get $50 a month for charging their vehicle 90% or more off peak, once we actually started managing those customers' charging experience, their off-peak charging significantly increased. So there was an 80% reduction in on-peak charging for those customers who participate in both the home charging incentive and in smart charge management. You can see that there's a 13% difference in off-peak charging between those who participate in managed charging and those who don't. So stacking our incentives, stacking the home charging incentive and smart charge management is not only beneficial for the customer, it's also beneficial for the grid. Next slide. Same's true for our time of use rate. I was, shocked when I started seeing some of these initial results, but you can see this chart goes all the way up until last Friday. We are seeing that there's a clear connection between our vehicle charging time of use rate customers and those who also participate in managed charging. So TOU participants have bumped their off-peak charging to above 98% when they also participate in smart charge management. So although these customers are already on an off-peak rate and the majority of them know to charge during off-peak hours, when they relinquish control of charging and they say the utility can just tell my vehicle when to charge, we are ensuring that they aren't starting their vehicle charging until that off-peak window hits. And so this is just one more example of how we're helping the customer and helping the grid by charging during off-peak windows. Next slide. And so there's a lot of flexibility around when a customer can actually charge their EV. So this is just a chart that shows the customers that are participating in our smart charge management program. Even those who are on a time of use rate have flexibility to charge during large stretches of time. So the average driver is plugged in for roughly 10 hours a day, but they only charge for 45 minutes. So for customers who maybe aren't participating in any of these programs, who have anxiety about participating in a time of use rate or a managed charging program because they think their vehicle won't be ready, this is just very clear to show them that your car just sits there for most of the time. And it's a great grid resource for us that if you let us, we can manage your charging and we can push it to any hour overnight, and you still have a lot of great flexibility that you can provide to the utility and you won't be impacted at all. So managed charging has really been seamless to the customer that they don't even notice when their charging is occurring and they still come out in the morning to a full charge. So coupling all of our time of use rate offerings, our off-peak offerings, and our managed charging offerings have been really beneficial for customers. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was fascinating. Really good presentation.